everybody. My name is Chris Alexander. I'm a librarian at the Saratoga Springs Public Library, and we're very excited to be co-sponsor of this Southern Adirondack Audubon Society program, American Woodcock Ecology and Management in the Northeast. This program is being recorded tonight, just the speakers and their slides. And the recording will probably be available next week, and I will send a link to everybody who's registered. And it's also going to be on the library's YouTube channel. You're welcome to put your questions in chat, and we will take those questions at the end. And at this point, I would like to introduce John Lowes, who's the president of the Southern Adirondack Audubon Society. And he has some announcements, and he's going to introduce our speakers, Dr. Roger Massey and Colby Slezak. Here, over to you, John.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. We love partnering with the Saratoga Springs Public Library. We just love it. And here we are again on a cold evening. You think it was 57 earlier today, but in any case, there's a lot to get through. This is a great program that I'm looking forward to. I am John Lowes, Programs Chair for the Southern Adirondack Audubon Society. And I'd like to thank you for tuning in tonight. Just a few announcements. Next month is Women's History Month. So we're bringing back the bird diva of Vermont, Bridget Butler, who will be presenting a special virtual program on March 23rd, featuring the latest research on female birds and the leading historical women in ornithology. You can register for this program with our fellow library partners at the Crandall Public Library out of Glens Falls. Our first Saturday bird walks at the Spring Run Trail in Saratoga Springs continue, led by our Ray Perry. The next one starts at 8 a.m. on Saturday, March 5th, starting at the trail parking area near the corner of East and Excelsior Avenues. So we hope to see you there. And lastly, we have a raffle giveaway. If you join Southern Adirondack Audubon through our membership website page as a chapter supporter or renew your support for $15 by the end of March, you'll receive 3 raffle entries to win a 2018 National Audubon Photo Award print. It is a wood duck print. This is a 36 by 24 inch print that was on national tour in 2019 and is mounted on durable styrene backing. This is a copy of what that looks like. It's got some snow. It's just a really neat print of a wood duck with snow on it. Incredible. It's probably our most favorite print out of the 12 that we had. Additional tickets can be purchased for every $5 donated through our website donation page. So you can donate as many $5 as you want, and that will hopefully increase your chances of winning this print that can be framed. The drawing will be held at the end of March. So good luck, and we appreciate your support. Our chapter relies on donations and annual chapter dues to help us bring these programs to you and our educational programs, as well as the other efforts that we do in conservation. There's a lot of new things coming up this year, which we'll talk about at other programs. And now on to our speakers. Dr. Roger Massey currently works as an assistant professor of wildlife management at SUNY Cobleskill. He earned his BS in wildlife biology from the University of Vermont, an MS in natural resources from Delaware State University, and a PhD in environmental science from the University of Rhode Island. Our second speaker, Colby Slezak, is a PhD student at the University of Rhode Island, studying American woodcock. The 2 primary objectives of his research are to learn more about female habitat selection and their nesting ecology. He collaborates with the Eastern Woodcock Migration Research Collaborative to deploy GPS transmitters throughout the East Coast and identify nest sites with the aid of several state, federal, and Canadian provincial wildlife biologists. Please help me give a warm welcome to our presenters tonight, Roger and Colby.
Great, thank you, John. I appreciate finally being able to make this work. This is something that John and I have been talking about for a few years now. When we think about it, John,
Yeah.
and then one thing after another kind of got in the way. COVID, of course, not helpful, but here we are, and glad to be here. I'm seeing 35 participants, so thank you all for showing up today. One nice thing about the virtual option is that it gives us some flexibility, not only to join from different areas, but to bring other people in and other people together. So Colby, thanks for coming on this evening as well. As you guys will see in a little bit, Colby is doing some of the latest and greatest of woodcock research in the Eastern US, using some unique technology, some unique approaches to factor in information about females, which has long been missing from woodcock research. So thanks for being here, Colby. I appreciate you helping to supplement what we're talking about today. So the approach here, we've got essentially some research talks that we're going to be going over as we tell this story about American woodcock ecology and management here in the Northeast USA. And you'll see my cursor here on the screen. I think, Chris, you can see my cursor moving around, yes? So I'll be using that to just kind of highlight certain things on the slides as we go. First, I want to kind of set the stage for why we have a concern about woodcock and similar young forest birds in general in the Northeast. And we can think about this through the lens of forest change. If we look for a historical benchmark, we can kind of pick arbitrary dates. Most commonly, people go back to around 1700, though, prior to European colonization of the Northeast. And what you see here is an artist rendition of what the pre-European colonization landscape in the Northeast likely looked like. We have over here on the right-hand side, you see indications of old growth forest. Of course, most of the Northeast, as you'll see in a few slides, heavily forested. And prior to European colonization, much of this, the vast majority, was older growth. We see large diameter trees over here on the far right. We see large coarse woody debris being pictured. But also notice that we see things like cedars over here on the left, and we see things like birch over here on the left. And these are young forest species. So it's important to keep in mind that while we may think of a historical landscape as dominated by old growth here in the Northeast, that wasn't the only forest type. And some estimates of the percent of young forest, depending on the region of the Northeast, extend upwards to maybe 13% or so of the landscape. Some areas had a very small component, others had relatively more. And that's important to keep in mind as we think about forest change through time, especially post-European settlement. Historically, we all know many of these forest disturbances. We see them now, some of them, some are less common than previously. Things like wind disturbance, you can see up here on the top left. Of course, fire, snow damage or ice storms this time of year, of course, can produce lots of young forest acreage, depending on the size of the storm that comes through. The bottom left here is showing the approximate time intervals of hurricane damage along the southern New England and extending into the interior zone of New England. And you can see that the coastal areas generally experience a bit more of this type of disturbance. Maybe every 85 years, you could expect hurricane damage for parts of Massachusetts, parts of Connecticut, and Rhode Island. There's also biological agents at work, of course. The middle picture here is showing beetle damage, so insect damage in general. Many of you, I would suspect, are familiar with emerald ash borer and the issues associated with that species. Some estimates suggest that maybe 7% of trees in New York, effectively all of the white ash, will be removed by that species, killed. So that'll create things like canopy openings that will facilitate the growth and regeneration of young forest. Beaver activity down there in the bottom middle. And then interestingly, I just mentioned in the last slide, pre-European settlement as a benchmark. What you're looking at in this bottom right-hand picture are the locations, these small circles, the locations of Native American establishments in southern New England. And the lines there are trail networks between these established areas. So these are based on archaeological digs. And we have lots of good documentation of how Native Americans would intentionally manipulate the land for certain uses, right? Maybe to promote production of fruits, for example. And so the management practices that they would use almost certainly put some young forest acreage on the ground as well prior to European settlement. And then we get to the point around 1740 where we start to have initial colonization of the Northeast by European settlers. Initially, what you can see in the top left here, very small scale disturbances, single family farm establishments going in, largely planting of small acreage to sustain, single dwelling families. But then when you fast forward into the 1830s through the 1880s, we see a rapid intensification of agriculture across the Northeast, coinciding with increases in population, increased settlement and expansion as well of European settlers. And so at this time, we essentially have a whole-scale conversion of our Northeastern landscape from one that's largely forested to one that is largely dominated by agriculture. And you can see that in this figure here in the bottom, where we start around 1600, 1650, 90% or so of the landscapes in these various states is forested. And then if we look forward to 1850, we see a very small proportion, 30% in many states, that's forested, and the rest has been converted to agriculture at that time. And notice, of course, that we see this upswing following 1850, where we start to now have an increase in forest cover as time goes on. So around 1850, European settlers start to abandon countrysides. They start to move to population centers. And this sets up a perfect scenario for succession to now start putting young forest acreage back on the ground. Around 1910, early 1900s generally, there's a lot of eastern white pine across the northeastern forest, and that's a valuable wood resource. So we see another conversion back to open land with the harvest of extensive acreages of white pine. And around 1950, getting into the 1920s, down here on the bottom left, we start to see the regeneration and the advancement of young hardwood species, really setting up much of the forest cover that we see today, even remnants of this early 1900 transition from pine-dominated stands to hardwood-dominated stands. And then you can see here on the bottom right in 1930, we have very prevalent amounts of young forest hardwoods across the northeastern landscape. And coinciding with this, of course, we see tremendous influxes in the populations of young forest species in the late 1800s through the mid 1900s. Things like American woodcock, things like ruffed grouse, young forest songbirds as well, reaching maximum abundances following this regeneration of young forest hardwoods. So this period then between 1850 to generally 1950 again, where you can see this rapid increase in forest extent across these New England states, this is really representing a tremendous amount of young forest growing on the landscape. Admittedly, if we think prior to European settlement, an artificially high amount, right, compared to our historical benchmark, because we had that widespread disturbance. And when you look at historical accounts of woodcock abundance around this time, the late 1800s, early 1900s, the market hunting days, there are records of market hunters killing 60 to 120 woodcock per day during this time. So a tremendous abundance of woodcock around the 1900s, much higher abundances than we have today. Once we hit the 1960s, we start having intentional monitoring of woodcock populations. And many of you have probably seen or heard woodcock display. Sean, you've seen this, you've helped catch birds. So hopefully this will bring back some fond memories for you. I'm gonna open a video real quickly, and let me make sure that this screen is sharing. of the courtship display, part of the courtship display of an American woodcock. There'll probably be a little advertisement here. We can hopefully skip this ad. And here we have our male woodcock giving his painting call on the ground. He'll spin in a circle and paint away. And so this is what biologists and volunteers listen for during woodcock monitoring. The paint call and then the flight call of the male as well. So there are really interesting species. I could play more minutes of that, but he does the same thing, I assure you, with that painting. I believe, John, can you just give me a thumbs up? Are we back on the slides now? Yeah. So that paint call is the ground portion, and then there's an aerial display that they give as well. And biologists, volunteers that conduct the singing ground survey drive predetermined routes and count the number of singing males that they hear each year. And we use this as managers as an index of population size. And you can see starting in 1968, when monitoring first began, extending out to 2018, and this trend continues into 2019 and 2020, we see this gradual decline through time of woodcock numbers. There's been about a 1% decrease per year. On an annual basis, that doesn't sound like much, right? 1% per year doesn't sound like much. But when you think about this as happening over decades of time, it really leads to a substantial number of woodcock that we've lost. Across the eastern region, you can see on the top right here, generally extending from Virginia up to Maine and the adjacent Canadian provinces, we have long-term significant decreases of woodcock numbers since 1968. And one of the reasons for that, the primary reason for that, is because of habitat loss and degradation through time. Most of us have, probably all of us, a very good idea of habitat loss occurring from the conversion of forest land to non-forest cover types, for example, building lots, parking lots, etc. And that's true certainly for woodcock, as it is with other forest species. But the unique thing about woodcock and about other young forest birds is that natural regeneration, natural successional processes through time also leads to habitat loss and degradation. If you have a 50-acre patch of young forest and you just let it grow through time, naturally, that becomes less suitable for woodcock. So we had this influx across the northeastern landscape from the 1850s to the 1950s of young forest. And then through time, that acreage has grown more mature, has become less suitable for woodcock. And that represents an important part of habitat loss for this species. You can see on the bottom left here, the variety of ways in which woodcock use younger forest stands. Recent forest clear cuts or agricultural openings, they tend to be preferred for singing grounds where males will give this paint call and they'll breed with females. Nesting cover, generally anywhere from 1 to 2 years old out to maybe 15 or 30-year-old forest. Woodcock will also use those areas to feed if the soil conditions are right. But then once we get beyond a 30-year-old forest stand, the structure starts to change. We start to have lower density of shrubs and saplings, maybe increased ground cover of herbaceous plants, for example, and the habitat becomes less suitable for woodcock and they no longer use those areas, okay? This figure on the top left here is illustrating some data from the forest inventory analysis with the US Forest Service. And you can see from 1948 to 1998, it's a little bit dated here, admittedly. We see this trend in young forest extent, generally some increases until the 1970s and then gradual declines. And if we extended that x-axis out to 2008 and 2018, we would see continual decline in the amount of, they call it seedling sapling timberland, basically young forest. we see a continual decline through time. And to give you some perspective, the red lines here that you see, the red dotted lines, are that historical benchmark where we talked about previously, up to maybe 13%, generally from 8% to 13% of the land. And so around the 1980s, 1990s, we were looking okay, kind of at that historical benchmark. But then we've seen a continual decline since then. And in the state of Rhode Island, what really started to spur some of this research that Colby and I will talk about, as of 2011 in the state of Rhode Island, only 3% of the land was in this state of young forest. So a very, very small part. And to make things worse, the acreage was further decreasing every year based on spatial analyses. So there was very little, and we were still losing more each year. And that spells trouble, of course, for birds and other wildlife that depend on this type of forest. So the overview of these different sections moving forward, I'll start by talking about our studies related to habitat use by woodcock, the methods that we used there. We then conducted a behavioral study trying to better understand why woodcock use different vegetation types in certain ways. Colby will come in and talk about the modern recent work that he's doing with nesting ecology, so that female aspect that'll be interesting. And then we'll finish up by considering this question of whether or not woodcock habitat management is for the birds. Admittedly, the practices to create woodcock habitat, primarily forest clear cutting, tend to be polarizing. Some people like that, some people see the benefit in that, and then other people don't. And so it's worth asking whether or not we can manage habitat for one species and expect a larger impact for a community or a related assemblage, for example. The study sites, just to give you a little bit of reference, Rhode Island, not a very big state. We were generally working in the southern third of the state. These sites are the same ones that Colby is working at as well. And I just wanted to show the cover types. Big River Management Area in the blue there. Notice in this pie chart that this site is largely dominated by coniferous upland forest. The red site, Arcadia Wildlife Management Area on the western side of the state, has a pretty even mix of deciduous forest, coniferous forest, and mixed upland forest. And then Great Swamp in the magenta color there down in the southern part of the state, as the name implies, a lot of forested wetland there, primarily red maple swamps. So Sean can attest that's a fun site to work at because you spend a lot of time in waders chasing woodcocks through the brush, trying to follow them and understand what it is that they're doing. So our first study, looking at habitat use, what really spurred this or stimulated this research was this idea that woodcock are really a key indicator species of young forest vegetation types, young forest habitat. They require not only an appropriate mixture of young forest and open fields, but it needs to be positioned on the landscape in fairly certain ways, because these birds, as you'll hear in the next section, make very consistent movements between young forest and open fields, generally where they spend the day and the night respectively during many parts of the year. And so if those areas are not in relative proximity to each other, then you can have lower quality habitat for woodcock if they can't access roosting sites, for example. The other important point here is that if we think about natural succession and the natural aging of forests, in order to preserve and conserve young forest on our landscape, we need to be actively managing it, right? We need to be okay with conducting forest clear cuts or timber stand improvement types of projects to keep young forest on the ground. Otherwise, we can expect it to continue to decline. And so if we understand something about where woodcock like to be, what they select for, we can improve our management decision-making, essentially, to be more impactful. So we looked at two different scales, a local scale where woodcock really focus their time, and then a larger landscape scale to try to predict where habitat use by woodcock was going to be most probable, again, in terms of trying to target future habitat management. And based on the previous literature, what we would expect is that woodcock would tend to favor areas that are characterized as young forests. So smaller overstory trees, maybe shorter trees, areas that have higher shrub and sapling density. And then we know that woodcock love to eat earthworms primarily. They will eat other soil macroinvertebrates, but they really like to eat earthworms. So we would expect that places where woodcock like to be would be high in food resources. So the methods here, this is the fun part. Sean, this is going to conjure up good memories, hopefully. I think actually, Sean, this may be you in this picture here that I took from, I think we were at Arcadia. But we set up mist nets, and we put the mist nets around the singing grounds where the males would come in to give their courtship display. And I mentioned a moment ago that birds typically move from forests to fields. And that's the case in the spring for these males. So they have no idea that we're there. As far as they're concerned, they're coming to their singing grounds to display. And then, of course, they fly into a net, and we go and we capture them. We remove them from the nets. We expose a little patch of skin on their back. Here you can see the transmitters that we attach that emit a beeping signal, and we use radio telemetry to pick up that signal to then follow them around. It's kind of the ultimate wildlife hide and seek, basically. John, you've experienced some of this as well, coming out with students. Here on the bottom right, you see a woodcock that's been outfitted with a radio tag. That's what they look like after we release them, and they go about their normal business. And I'll note here before I go on that we are dealing with these studies, these early studies, exclusively with males. And Colby will probably mention this too. And this was a shortcoming of some of this early work. It was male-biased research. This was some of the first woodcock work to be conducted at this scale in Rhode Island. And males are just much easier to catch. We knew we had lots of them on our landscape, and we could catch them very easily. So that was one of the driving decisions there for targeting males. Here's Lindsay Barnard, one of our technicians. Once we tag things, we then have to follow things. And so from May to August, we spent a lot of time walking in on foot to all of these radio tag birds and collecting GPS points. The figure over here on the right-hand side with the different colors, these are 4 different birds that were marked, and they were spending time relatively close to one another, within about 300 or 400 meters of one another at Arcadia Management Area. And I'll bother to kind of foreshadow a little bit. Notice that a lot of these points seem to be associated with waterways, riparian areas, wetland forests, these sorts of things, okay? That's not a coincidence. They really like these sites, as we found, and as you'll see in a moment. For the analysis part, we couldn't use all 92 birds because some of them, their transmitters fall off, some of them die from predation, this sort of thing. But we were able to include 52 of our males that had a sufficient number of points throughout the summer so that we could really say something about their summer habitat use. Some more fun pictures just to give you some idea at the scale that we're talking and how we sampled habitat. Notice the scale bars in these 2 figures on the left and the middle. We're not talking about very large distances, right? So these 2 woodcock here on the far left, number 701 and number 463, they spent essentially the entire summer in a very small area, about 100 meters long and maybe 50 meters wide. These are their daytime locations. And what we did after we identified these diurnal coverts, we went in and we sampled vegetation. And so in the middle figure here, you can see these little green dots. These green dots are where we would go and set up 5-meter radius plots. We would count shrubs and saplings. We would measure soil characteristics. We would measure trees, etc. And to pair that with areas that woodcock were not found, over here on the far right-hand side, you can see these green dots that are randomly located on the landscape outside of these places that woodcock liked to be. So some of this data collection focused on where we knew woodcock were, and then also where we did not find them, collecting the same variables and then making some comparisons. Here's a laundry list. I won't bother to go through this, but recognize that the types of things we were interested in, tree characteristics, shrub sapling density, soil characteristics, Food resources, right? So we had a series of earthworm variables that we collected, given the importance of earthworms for woodcock food. And then we made some comparisons between those two types of areas, where woodcock were and where woodcock were not. The next thing we did was to look at a larger spatial scale. So rather than focusing just on where woodcock concentrated their time, we calculated their home ranges, which is a larger landscape type of assessment. And we characterized using GIS features of their home range, cover types, distance to certain landscape features like streams, distance to agriculture, this sort of thing. And this larger scale application is what allowed us to really map across the state of Rhode Island where woodcock were most likely to be found, to help inform that targeted decision making. In order to do that, we used what's called resource selection functions. It's essentially just a mathematical model where we feed it different variables, and we have locations where woodcock were, we have locations where woodcock were not. The math magic, being what it is, compares those two, and then it spits back out to us a map showing us relative probability of use. And I'll show you that map in a few slides from now. Again, a number of variables, primarily things like forest cover type, and then these distance criteria that you see down here: distance to the nearest stream, nearest agricultural opening, distance to upland young forest, and distance to moist soil. Were important variables in these models. And I'll show you those results in a moment and the interpretation of those. So as these figures are showing, this is one figure here for one bird at Big River. You can see that the magenta dots here are really clustered. So these diurnal coverts where woodcock spend most of their time are quite small. Generally, they're less than a hectare in size. A hectare is about 2.5 acres, right? So very small sites where woodcock are spending most of their time during the summer. But they do move around the landscape a little bit. And so this larger landscape perspective is an important one to consider. Where they focus their time, though, three general groupings of variables prove to be important. And these related to the characteristics of the forest overstory, characteristics of the resource base in terms of food, and then the forest understory condition as well. For the overstory, where we found woodcock, really this table down here on the right is what we should be paying attention to. The plot location, whether or not it was inside a woodcock diurnal covert or outside. Think back to those green dots. Some of them were where woodcock were found. Some of them were where they were not found. The data is telling us that even though young forest is rare on Rhode Island at this time in 2011, woodcock were seeking out areas of younger forest. So they had smaller trees, shorter canopy heights. The diameter of trees was smaller. The overstory size class of trees was smaller, compared to areas that woodcock were avoiding, which tended to be relatively more mature, older growth forest. If we take a look at the earthworm resources or the food resources for woodcock, not too surprising, in line with what we would expect. The areas where woodcock were spending their time were just littered with earthworms. We would dig these soil plots and count earthworms and dry earthworms and weigh earthworms, all of the fun lab stuff. And we found consistently many, many more earthworms inside those diurnal covers compared to outside where woodcock were not found. And then as far as the forest understory, interestingly, we found that soil characteristics didn't differ between the sites where woodcock were found and where they were not found. But shrub and sapling density was particularly important, and it was much higher where woodcock tended to be found during the day. So they really rely on that dense shrub layer to provide some protection from predators, primarily during the day. As I'll talk about in a moment, they move away from these areas at night, which is an interesting story that we decided to investigate. The home range sizes, rather than being small, these were now very, very large, talking about 50 hectares or so on average, so a couple of 100 acres, where a bird would range across the landscape, for example, throughout the summer period. Sometimes these birds will follow waterways. So the Wood River, the Pawcatuck River in Rhode Island, important riparian zones there. Other times these birds are moving across the landscape to exploit agricultural fields primarily for their nighttime roosts. So they focus during the day on very small areas, but then they tend to range at night or at different parts of the summer across different areas of the landscape. This table here on the right, this is showing you for these various variables that we measured, again, forest cover types, deciduous wetland forest, so some abbreviations here, DEC, that stands for deciduous, wet, that's wetland, mix is mixed forest, con here is coniferous forest, and then up is upland forest. The take-home message here is really what's in the red rectangles. When we estimated where woodcock were most likely to be found on a landscape scale, the wetland forests really jumped out as positive places. So our probability of use is much higher in wetland forests than any other forest cover type for woodcock. Primarily, that's because of two reasons. One, the soils tend to be moist in these areas. They tend to be very productive in terms of shrub development, and they tend to have a very high abundance of earthworms. The other variables that were important in dictating woodcock use were these distances, and you can see these down here on the bottom: distance to agriculture, distance to moist soil, distance to streams, and distance to upland young forest. And what these negative signs mean is that as you go further away from these landscape characteristics, so as you go further away from an agricultural opening, woodcock are less likely to be found. And the reason for that, there are many. In the spring, they use these sites for breeding. In the summer, they use these sites for roosting. In the fall, they use them for roosting as well. And so I mentioned a few moments ago about the importance of the spatial positioning of these different landscape features. And that really was illustrated with these distance criteria here. Young forest is great, active management is great, but it needs to be located in the right places to be beneficial, most beneficial for woodcock. So all of that tracking, all of that modeling essentially leads to this map here, which is showing us relative probability of use by American woodcock. This is essentially a heat type map. So the red and the orange are higher probabilities of use, the blue and the greenish lower probabilities of use. And you can see that high probability of use areas, so high quality woodcock habitat generally, are widely scattered across the state. And this is what we would expect given the fact that young forest is widely scattered across the state. And these wetland areas, these wetland forests, are scattered across the state as well. So nothing terribly surprising here as far as the distribution, but this probability of use allows us to now determine where management of additional woodcock habitat might be most beneficial, right? We could target management in areas of relatively low use, convert parts of the land in those areas to woodcock habitat, and we can see the benefit of that by tracking woodcock in future years and predicting whether or not those management actions would increase probability of use at those sites. So to wrap up this part, the fact that daytime activity was highly localized, that's been observed in other places. We see this with woodcock in Pennsylvania, in Minnesota and Alabama as well. And young forest species, if we think about their ecology, are adapted to exploit small pockets of preferred habitat. Those forest disturbances that I mentioned, wind disturbance, ice damage, that sort of thing, we tend to see small pockets of young forest being created. And so these species are adapted to exploit those rather than, vast areas of young forest, for example. Woodcock that we were studying, true to form, selected younger forest stands. They really like abundant shrubs and saplings. This picture over here on the right is essentially showing you where we find woodcock during the day. Very dense areas. You can see the water in the foreground here. So riparian areas are very important. And then abundant earthworm resources as well. And again, similarities across much of the Northeast. Most of the land in Rhode Island at the time of these studies was in a rather low probability of use by woodcock. Most of the land, not too surprisingly, was not that suitable. And so that really highlighted the need, if we're interested in conserving woodcock and other young forest species, to adopt active habitat management. And what you're seeing here is a recent forest clear cut on the bottom left. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a map that's illustrating the timber management strategy at the woodcock demonstration area at Great Swamp Wildlife Management Area. And the idea here is not to convert entire landscapes to young forest, but rather to do it in a very strategic way and a rotational way so that we're managing the same acreage through time. If you remember several slides ago, I talked about how once a forest stand gets about 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, it becomes less suitable for woodcock. If we're interested in managing young forest, we can go back to those same areas 40 years down the road, harvest timber from them again, and improve that habitat once more for young forest species. So what you see here at this woodcock demonstration area, a series of clear cuts that were put in 1995, some were put in 2007 and 2012, 2015, most recently in 2020. And the idea is to revisit these on a 30-year rotation. So much of Great Swamp Management Area, for example, will remain as maturing second growth forest that won't be harvested. But some component of it, about 10% of the land, for example, will be maintained in this rotation of young forest to help conserve woodcock and other young forest species. Okay, so I mentioned also that woodcock make these movements from forest to field. So this sort of scenario that we see here, spending the day in areas on the left, and then moving to areas that you see on the right, generally herbaceous openings, agricultural openings. And not much was known about this at the time of these studies in 2011 and 2012. It was clear that both types of vegetation were necessary for providing woodcock habitat because they would make these consistent movements. But there hadn't really been any detailed study to try to illustrate the benefit of that movement. It's pretty apparent in the spring when males move to these areas to display. They're doing that for a breeding purpose. The cost of making that movement seems logically justified by reproduction. But they do the same movement in the summer. Many birds do. And they do the same type of movement in the fall too. And there's not the same type of reproductive benefit there. So we were surmising there must be some benefit in order for woodcock to assume that cost, whether it's an energetic cost or exposing themselves to predators by moving from one area and going to another. And so we wanted to test these competing hypotheses. There was some suggestion in the literature that maybe they made these movements because there were better feeding opportunities in fields at night, or maybe they were moving to these areas because they were relatively more safe from predators. So we had these two hypotheses that we wanted to test, and to do so, we did things like follow birds night and day. This was a very intense, lots of hours went into this tracking. And then we measured things. We measured food abundance and we measured predator activity as well. So if the foraging benefit hypothesis is what's at play here, then we would expect that the forest openings that these birds would move to would have higher food resources, right? If a bird was moving from a forest to a field at night to feed, we would expect to see more food in those openings at nighttime. The predation risk hypothesis, if this was the case, then we would expect to see a more active predator assemblage where they are during the day, where woodcock are during the day, and therefore they leave these sites to go to safer grounds at night where they can roost, if the predation risk hypothesis is driving this characteristic behavior. So I mentioned the intensity with which we tracked birds here. I'll just bother to point out the hours, and I'll ask that you imagine doing this. So from 6 in the morning to 7 at night, we would track birds during the day. We would monitor where individuals were. And then the really unique thing with radio telemetry, this is Wes here, one of our technicians, we can follow the same bird day and night. So generally from 8:30 in the evening to 2:40 or so the following morning, we were tracking these birds at night. And you can see in this picture here, this individual bird would spend his days along the Woodcock River down here. The line you see going in this direction is a railroad track. It would be awful nice if we could access these places by walking along the railroad tracks, but we were not allowed to. So we had to walk through the floodplain forests with waders. And then this bird would leave this diurnal covert during the day, right at dusk basically, and fly to these recent clear cuts to spend the night. And he would be there all night long unless we disturbed him, unless we flushed him. And so this type of paired comparison was really powerful because we allowed individual birds to make their choice where they wanted to be. And then we measured things about where they were. So here's one of my coastal fellows during this time. This is Donna Marie. She took the lead on this project. And what you can see here, where she is where we flushed a woodcock from at night. So we would find our marked bird, we would walk up to it, we would flush it, and we would immediately dig soil and store that soil so that we could come back the next day and collect earthworms, collect ants, collect beetles, whatever there was for woodcock food, we would collect, okay? And we did that at the flush site, which is where Donna Marie is there. But we also did that at 5 meters in each cardinal direction. So to the north, south, east, and west of where each woodcock was found. Collectively, we included 38 woodcock for this part of the study, an awful lot of soil digging, an awful lot of earthworm counting. And I will say an awful lot of poison ivy too, as we're sorting through the soil. The other thing that we did was this predator piece. And so for a subset of these birds, for 23 of these birds, we created these track stations by loosening the soil. We baited them with tuna fish that was placed right in the middle. And then we would return each day to monitor the presence of mammal tracks. So things like raccoons, things like red fox, things like coyote, et cetera, Virginia opossum. And we would keep track of the number of times and the number of species that were visiting these track plates, where woodcock spent the day and where they spent the night, and we could make some comparisons. In 2012, we also used trail cameras that were baited with a quail carcass to quantify predator activity in a different way. The trail cameras gave us a little bit more power. We could determine exactly when a predator or a scavenger came in, how many different visits there were to an area. We also started to get information on raptors as well as potential predators in 2012. So what we found regarding food availability, this figure that you're seeing right here, this is showing you the difference in earthworm weight. And we calculated difference as what we found at the diurnal covert minus what we found at the nocturnal roost. And I'll ask you to pay attention to the red arrows here and recognize that the positive bars here mean that diurnal coverts had more food than nocturnal roost sites, okay? So what we found as far as food availability was that earthworms were much more abundant, significantly more abundant where woodcock were during the day compared to where they went to at night. I've never dug and sorted more soil and not found an earthworm at all than I have at woodcock roost sites. It was really, really surprising the lack of earthworms that we found there. This figure that you can see here, this is showing you the difference in total prey density. So this is including earthworms and spiders and ants and beetles and all the other little tasties that woodcock might eat. And notice here that the error bars include the value of 0. So this is telling us that there's no difference in total prey density between where woodcock are during the day and where they are at night. So further evidence that they're not moving to these places to exploit food because there's plenty of food available where they spend the day. And then a similar type of figure over here on the bottom right, this is showing you richness and diversity of woodcock foods, different diversity measures. And again, either higher at woodcock diurnal coverts or similar. So we effectively found no evidence that woodcock moved to these areas at night to feed, because they had plenty of food resources for them where they were spending their time during the day. The predator side of things, this picture here is showing a raccoon print, just to give you an example of what we were finding with our track plates. And again, the red arrows here, values that are showing positive bars. So for most of these birds, you see positive bars. This is telling us that diurnal coverts had more visits by predators than nocturnal roosts. And so because of that, nocturnal roost sites were the safer place to go for most of the birds that we monitored. There were a couple of birds that moved to areas that had relatively higher predator activity, but across the individuals that we included, most of them were moving to safer areas. And we found the same thing with our trail cameras. Here's a really interesting picture of a blonde coyote that visited one of the woodcock diurnal covert sites. You can see the quail carcass there drawing this individual in. In this figure, it's important to recognize that the y-axis is different here. This is showing you the difference in the number of days until the initial visit by a predator. So how many days go by before a predator initially visits where a woodcock was during the day and during the night? And in this case, in this bottom figure, the negative bars are telling us that nocturnal roost sites had more days go by before a predator visited, and therefore they were the safer places. So a different way to tell us the same story, essentially, that nocturnal roosts, these open fields, are safe places for woodcock to be. So again, in conclusion, we didn't find any evidence that they moved to these areas to feed, but what we did find was that there was a much less active predator community in these open fields compared to where woodcock were during the day. I mentioned a moment ago the paired nature of this study was really unique. Previous studies that tried to address this would do things like collect birds at a roost site and flush their crop to see what they had in their crop for food. We have no way of knowing, though, if that food was consumed at the roost site or earlier in the day. So that paired design was really unique for our studies and more telling, because we could use the behavior of the bird to help inform what it was that they were benefiting by moving. A couple of fun pictures here. Domestic cats showed up in very unusual places. Fisher, every now and then, we would get on trail camera as well. And so this study was really the first empirical support that we had for the predation risk hypothesis, and really highlights the need for these forest openings, whether they're agricultural openings, very recent forest clear cuts that are herb dominated types of areas. If we don't have these on the landscape, then woodcock essentially don't have a safe place to go during summer nights. So at this point, we're going to segue now. A couple of pictures here illustrating some of the work that Colby's been engaged with. I'm going to stop sharing, and Colby can pick up here talking about his current work.
Hi, everyone. As John and Roger mentioned, I'm a PhD student at the University of Rhode Island, and I'm working in the same lab that Roger worked in 10 years ago with Scott McWilliams. So I have less results than Roger because I'm still in the middle of my PhD, but I'm going to go over like each of the chapters that I'm researching and give you an overview of the data that we're collecting. And so the first chapter is going to be about habitat selection of male and female woodcock in southern New England. So similar to what Roger was doing, but now adding in females. The second chapter is focused on the nesting ecology of woodcock. And I'm doing this at a local and more regional scale. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the final chapter is going to be looking at how we manage forests actually influence woodcock survival. So here's this map of my study areas. Roger kind of showed you the areas he was using, mainly Arcadia, Big River, and Great Swamp. And we've kind of expanded this in the past 10 years to a few more sites. So now we have Nicholas Farm, Tillinghast Pond, and Francis Carter. So for my methods, I'm going to kind of give a broad overview of how I'm capturing these males and females. And that kind of feeds into the different chapters. The methods are generally pretty similar throughout. So like Roger, we're capturing males at singing grounds and attaching the same VHF transmitter that he showed you in some of his photos. And during the past 2 years, we've caught 112 males. And we're also doing that same 3 times per week tracking to get some information about their habitat use during the day. But luckily, I don't have to go out at night. So one of the things that Roger had mentioned was that there was no females in the data set at the time he was doing this. So a lot of states in the northern US, like Maine, Michigan, and Minnesota, have these woodcock pointing dog programs where they're actually finding nests and broods in their state. And so Rhode Island had nothing like this, but I was really interested in researching females so we could learn more about their habitat use. So I was able to get together about 20 volunteer dog handlers, and you can see in that bottom left photo, one of the dogs that had successfully found a brood, and there's me and one of my technicians. I'm banding the chicks. And so now that we have dogs, we've been able to actually find females and attach the same VHF transmitters that Roger had. And during the breeding season, we're tracking them pretty regularly, like 2 times per week, to learn more about their survival and what they're using when they have chicks, what habitat they're using. And so we've got a total of 42 females during the past 2 seasons, and we're going to repeat this coming spring. And something that's interesting in the past few years is that woodcock chicks, you can see this photo in the bottom left, that little transmitter around its neck. So we're actually able to get survival on the chicks too, because if they're predated, we can find the carcass, or if they live, we can track them to fledge. So those transmitters last about 30 days. So Roger kind of talked about resource selection with the male woodcock he was doing. So I'm going to be repeating that same analysis, but now with males and females during my 2-year period that I've been tracking them so far. And Roger didn't really mention this, but between me and Roger, there's been 2 other grad students, 2 master students, Steve Brenner and Clay Graham. And Steve was actually able to validate Roger's resource selection function. He moved birds from high quality landscapes to low quality landscapes. And he found that the woodcock actually were returning back to the high quality landscape. So they were able to assess the landscape at a landscape scale and could really, they can assess quality really well. So if we create habitat for woodcock, it really benefits them. So this kind of gave us some reason to try and find out what females are using so that we can also better manage for them and hopefully stabilize our populations in Rhode Island. And so like Roger mentioned, even though I've caught, over 100 males, I've only been able to track 50 throughout the whole entire summer period for this analysis and 20 females so far. And we've had a total of 37 broods that we found using these pointing dogs. So the second part of my work is focused on nesting ecology, and this is at like a local and a more broad scale. So in Rhode Island, we really weren't sure if there was a breeding population. A lot of the accounts for woodcock show that, the southern New England area and some of these more mid-Atlantic states really don't contribute much to woodcock populations as a whole. But, we've been really fortunate. We found a bunch of nests, 33 of them so far, and 37 broods. And so I'm doing some more fine scale vegetation measurements at these nest sites. And in this center map, you can see these yellow dots. This is from the past season, all the nests that we found. And I have coastal fellows, some undergrads out there, doing the same type of design as Roger that he did with his nighttime sites. So in this upper left picture, you can see the center is a nest site. And then we have some paired sites that aren't nest sites, but that were deemed available to the bird. And they're taking these measurements like canopy cover, stem density, vegetation height, so that we can try to see what resources females are actually selecting for during this period when they're selecting nest sites. And something interesting, like Roger had mentioned, you can see the streams in this photo. Most of these nest sites are along these riparian corridors, so they're really important to woodcock, it seems. And then as part of this larger nesting project I was talking about, I'm participating in the Eastern Woodcock Migration Research Collaborative. And so there's about 34 cooperators, state and federal, and in Canada. And they're all deploying tags on the wintering grounds. So when these woodcock migrate south, they're going out and capturing them on the roost fields at night. And I'm tracking their movements throughout the spring and looking for really localized movements to try and identify nest sites. So here in Rhode Island, I've attached 30 tags prior to fall migration. I follow them to their wintering grounds, and then as they move back north in the spring, I'm looking for those small movements, and then I send someone out to try and verify the nesting attempt. And so capturing woodcock in the fall and on the wintering grounds is a little bit different. We don't use mist nets. You can see in this right photo, that's me with one of my lab mates out at night capturing woodcock with these long-handled nets. So you pretty much stun them with spotlights, and they kind of freeze, and then you can capture them and attach a tag. And so these tags in the bottom left are a little attached differently, and they don't require tracking like manually. They'll actually transmit points right to your computer. And then we get these really nice animation maps, like you can see in the middle, that characterize their movements really well. So I was just going to mention for everyone, there's a website called woodcockmigration.org, and there's also 2 other grad students who are working on this project with some different objectives, but all of the locations from birds tagged as part of this project, you can actually follow their migration paths and see where they were tagged. So it's kind of an interesting site if you're interested in that. And so this whole project has been allowing me to get some movement patterns of these nesting hens, learn about timing of nesting throughout the whole entire flyaway. And I'm also able to get some indication of success because I'm having people actually go out and verify the nest. And some of them have gone above and beyond and actually are monitoring the nest to see what the fate is. And so this past year, which was the first season of this flyaway nesting project, we found 17 nests. And they range all the way from North Carolina into Quebec. And we found something really interesting, that woodcock have a unique breeding system, which I'll show you on the next slide. But here on the bottom, these are just some of the pictures that the collaborators were able to get while out in the field. That photo with the snow in it, where they're pointing to that little tiny dot there, that was the woodcock nest site. And all the way to the right, you can see this lynx track. And this biologist in Maine had found the nests within probably an hour after it had been predated. So really interesting find there. So this here just kind of shows you what I'm looking for as I'm trying to identify these nests at this really broad scale. You can see here that the nesting woodcock, which are the orange points, have really different movements than non-nesting points. So they have these really small, localized movements over a more extended period of time. And like this nest here was one I actually missed, but I'm pretty sure there was a nest, the one with the star. But there's also, user error because woodcock nests are incredibly difficult to find. So we're going to use the data on nests that have been verified to try and identify more nests from previous years of tagged woodcock as part of this collaborative that's been happening for about 5 years now. So it's kind of working as a validation set to identify more nests from past years. So this is some of the nest sites we found during 2021. So any of the yellow points you see on here were actually birds that we found an initial nest attempt for and a second nest attempt. And something really interesting is that they move really long distances between some of these nesting attempts. And this really hasn't been observed in many species of birds. It's called like an itinerant breeding system. So they breed between 2 distinct places. And some of these nests, like this one up here in Canada, we didn't actually find the re-nest, but they still moved a considerable distance after the nest had failed. So it seems like woodcock are moving north throughout the breeding season, likely nesting during migration, probably following some food resources as they become available later in the spring. And so the final component of my work is actually trying to assess survival for woodcock. We've had these 3 tracking studies over the past 10 years, and then, mine is the 4th. And so we have a lot of information about survival from our VHF tracking. And this is kind of one of those missing components that will help us create a state woodcock management plan that not only describes how habitat benefits woodcock, but how that habitat may influence their survival. And I'm also going to be able to do this for the breeding season for hens and broods. Most of the tracking that's taken place has happened in the summer, so that's what we're going to be able to assess over the 10-year period for males. And so I'm getting into my final field season this year, and the male-female summer tracking study has kind of come to an end. So I'm going to be working on assessing their female and male habitat use this summer. And then we're going to continue this nesting study for one more year. So I'm going to be doing this more local Rhode Island study and regional nesting attempt study. And those updates will be posted on that woodcockmigration.org site. And that's all I have. So I think we're going to switch back to Roger.
Thank you, Colby. Really interesting stuff that you're doing there. The novelty of the satellite tracking is really remarkable. John or Chris, can you just give me a thumbs up to confirm my slides are back up and visible now? Okay. So to finish us out, hopefully Colby and I have convinced you woodcock are really cool. They're a species that's worth saving, that's worth conserving. But are there other species that that benefit from woodcock habitat management? I mentioned way back at the beginning that things like timber harvest, you know, when I say the word forest clear cut, for some of you that conjures a very negative feeling, and for some of you, you don't necessarily care, and for some of you, you get excited about that sort of thing. So because it's a controversial management practice, if we can illustrate a broader benefit beyond woodcock, then we can sell that type of management more easily, right? And I suspect many of you, given that we're at a birder seminar, essentially, right, John? Many of you are familiar with these young forest species, whether we're talking about field sparrows or blue-winged warblers or eastern towhees or prairie warblers, et cetera, et cetera. So this question of whether or not woodcock habitat management is quote unquote for the birds was an important one for us to try to answer. And again, just to kind of bring back some base information here, these forest openings, these forest clear cuts, abandoned meadows, these sorts of things are required for breeding, and they're temporary, right? So remember this figure on the top here. If you don't actively provide this on the landscape, vegetation grows, woody encroachment makes places less suitable for courtship and reproduction. So we've got to be active in our management of these sites to keep them on the landscape. Furthermore, when you look at current management goals by many state agencies, there's interest in, they're called young forest initiatives, trying to conserve acreage of young forest. And many states have this 10% goal where they want to see 10% of their public land, for example, in a young forest state. So again, if we can illustrate a broader benefit of that to a more diverse assemblage, then that would be generally a positive thing. You can see here some species: eastern towhee, field sparrow, prairie warbler. The red numbers, all negative, these are showing you the annual percent decreases based on the breeding bird survey. So I mentioned that woodcock were declining by about 1% per year. In parts of the Northeast, that decline is more steep for some of these other young forest species. And so we wanted to see if we could build the case for using woodcock as an umbrella species, essentially. Manage woodcock for habitat, or manage habitat for woodcock rather, and then create a benefit for a number of other species that fall underneath that umbrella. So what we did was identify singing grounds where we captured these birds. We paired those with random forest sites on the landscape. And then we conducted a series of point counts and compared things like number of bird species, number of individuals, relative abundance, et cetera, at these singing grounds and random forest sites. And if woodcock could serve as an umbrella species, we would expect these metrics to be higher at woodcock singing grounds. Where we create woodcock habitat, we have more young forest birds, songbirds, for example. So to do that, I described it just a minute ago, and you can see it here in this map on the right-hand side. We had a series of singing grounds in the blue dots here, and then we had a series of these random forest sites in the red dots. And these were scattered across the different management areas that Colby and I introduced previously. At each of these locations, we would conduct standard point counts, record the species we were hearing and seeing, numbers of individuals, et cetera. Generally from late May to early July, we were conducting this work. Things like blue-winged warblers, very common at some of these sites that we manage for woodcock, as well as other young forest species. And so here's what we found. This is showing you the relative abundance of the most common species that we documented. The dark gray are the numbers for woodcock singing grounds, the light gray for random forest sites. And you can notice there's some differences here. Species like gray catbird, yellow warbler, common yellowthroat, prairie warbler here in the middle. You can see that they're more abundant, consistently more abundant at woodcock singing grounds than random forest sites. That's because they're young forest birds. They really thrive in that type of setting. Other species like veery and ovenbird, red-eyed vireo in some cases, northern water thrush at Great Swamp, those were more abundant at random forest sites. So they are not young forest species. They prefer more mature forest for the breeding season. And so we found those in higher abundances at those random sites. Here we have the number and diversity of birds, all species combined, and you can see a similar story here. Higher diversity, higher number of individuals at woodcock singing grounds compared to those random forest sites, with a particularly high abundance of those young forest species. Again, things like yellow warbler, for example. So our prediction, we were able to confirm that, what we were expecting if woodcock could be considered an umbrella species was in fact occurring on the landscape. Again, we had higher relative abundance of young forest birds. The total number of all individuals across all species was higher, and then diversity was higher as well at woodcock singing grounds. And so this was really the first support that we were able to gather to illustrate that woodcock can in fact be considered a young forest species, or not a young forest species rather, but an umbrella species. And this image here really shows what we're talking about. If you create woodcock habitat by forest clear cutting, by maintaining some agricultural openings, doing that in a strategic way on your landscape, then you can have a very positive impact for lots of other species, whether it's whippoorwills or prairie warblers, chestnut-sided warbler, often found in high abundances in woodcock habitat as well. And especially that assemblage of young forest birds, very, very much linked to areas where woodcock were found. And so these best management practices that I talked about earlier, where we can have a rotational approach of harvesting timber across our landscape. Remember that figure of the 30-year rotation. That type of approach on a landscape scale can help to increase bird diversity and help to increase numbers of these declining young forest birds as well, beyond just woodcock. Some of you are probably wondering about the more mature forest species, so things like ovenbird and veery. And it's true that they don't breed in young forest, but additional research from other folks in Massachusetts, for example, they've been able to illustrate that these more mature forest breeding birds, like red-eyed vireo, like ovenbird and like veery, after the fledging season, so once their young leave the nest, these species often actively seek out patches of young forest on the landscape. There's likely to be higher food abundance. The increase in vertical complexity associated with a young forest likely provides protection from predators. So by doing things like mist netting, for example, in forest clear cuts in August and September, or tracking fledglings after they leave the nest, we've been able to illustrate that even these species that prefer mature forest to breed actively seek out young forest after the breeding season. And so that importance of young forest not only has relevance to young forest breeding birds, but also these other species that we tend to think of as more mature forest species as well. And collectively, what this study really helped to illustrate is that we're not talking about landscape scale conversion to young forest, but rather strategic management where we put young forest in the proper places while simultaneously leaving some forest to grow older for these mature forest species to provide essentially this diversity of habitat for a diversity of wildlife. So with that, that concludes what we wanted to share with you all, and we'd love to take any questions from you. Some folks I see were putting some questions in the chat, so I'll go through and read these. And if you have other questions, feel free to type them and we can answer them as we go along. Tom is asking, are there any woodcock in upstate New York? Yes, indeed, Tom. Woodcock thrive in upstate New York. In Schoharie County, where I am, where I live, the agricultural hillsides, lots of abandoned farmland as well. If you get into the Adirondacks, any place where you have active timber harvest on your landscape and patches of young forest, you're very likely to have woodcock populations. A question by Joyce. How do invasive jumping worms affect habitat quality for woodcocks? Joyce, that's an excellent question. And when you think about woodcock and earthworms, the really interesting thing is that earthworms weren't around, most species that we have now weren't around when the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago, right? And so most of our earthworm abundance that we have is invasive varieties, and woodcocks love to eat them. So I think these invasive jumping worms, if a woodcock can catch it, which they're very good with that bill, of course, they're happy to eat them. So they would just view them as a food option, I think. There's other issues with some of these invasive earthworms, of course, changes that they may have to soil geochemistry, maybe to the detritus layer in a forest that can have impacts on the biota that occur there, potentially vegetative impacts as well. But as far as woodcock, if they can catch it, they'll happily eat a variety of species of earthworms, as well as other soil macroinvertebrates as well. Earthworms are just particularly abundant. A question from Deb. Where do woodcock roost? On the ground, in the grass, etc. So woodcock spend all of their life on the ground. Well, except when they're flying, of course, right? So when they fly to these roost sites, they're sitting on the ground. They'll often kind of tuck themselves maybe next to a tuft of grass type of thing, but they move to rather open areas. Picture a hayfield for a moment. You've all seen hayfields. If you have a hayfield in August that's not been cut, so the hay is 3 feet high, for example, a woodcock will not use that as a roost site because it can't access the ground very easily. If you take that hayfield and say in late July, mow some strips in the hayfield, you could mow a consistent pattern, you could just randomly mow however you wanted to. But if you create that very short grass structure, that's what they want because they can stand on the ground, maybe hide against the edge of the grass, etc. But they require that short grass scenario. Forest clear cuts, recent forest clear cuts that have a lot of bare ground or sparsely vegetated ground, those are popular places for them to roost as well. Emily, good question. How important is raptor predation? There's a woodcock preserve in southern Saratoga County with a transmission line. And would that reduce usefulness of the preserve? Good question. So raptor predation, let's start there. Something I didn't share with you all when we were doing the predator studies is that we went to great lengths to try to document raptor predation. Raptors certainly prey on woodcock for sure. What we did was capture pigeons, rock pigeons. We created these predator-proof structures and deployed live pigeons in the field with trail cameras to try to monitor predator activity. Some of you may have familiarity with raptors and falconry and that sort of thing. It's very common when we're trying to catch raptors to put a prey item in a cage to draw a raptor in. That's essentially what we were trying to do. We found very, very little raptor activity at either their diurnal coverts or their nocturnal roosts. So raptors will certainly take woodcock if they're able to, but it seems much more likely that mammalian predators, raccoon and mink in particular, are likely the more significant of the predators for woodcock. Colby, do you want to comment on predation of your broods and hens?
Yeah, so predation on the hens and broods seems to be much higher than males, we found. But, it may be actually just something that they kind of evolved with, that they have these really high predation rates, and that may be why they move between nesting attempts, we're thinking, as actually some kind of strategy to get away from those high predation risks once they actually encounter them. So, maybe they try to nest in Rhode Island and the predation rate was really high, or they were experiencing a lot of predators while they were incubating. And so maybe they get up and move to another state for their second nesting attempt. So it's really not clear if those predation rates in Rhode Island are really, representative of the woodcock population or if they're kind of inflated. But hopefully we find out.
And weasels particularly important, right, Colby?
Yeah, we find a lot of the woodcock chicks in stone walls or buried under the ground. So a lot of mammalian predators seem to be important for woodcock chicks, especially because they're in kind of more closed forest areas a lot of time.
Yeah. Your other question there, Emily, the transmission line, that wouldn't necessarily have a negative impact on woodcock habitat. If anything, that may actually be useful because, as you know, with transmission lines, we like to maintain them as young forest or field. I can tell you at two of the three study sites, Big River and Great Swamp, we've caught woodcock underneath the dull hum of transmission lines because those areas are open. The birds will go there. They'll paint. They'll give their courtship display. They're quite agile in the air, so literally flying down to their singing ground and dodging these transmission lines as they go. So not necessarily degrading woodcock habitat with that feature. Barb is asking, do birds return to the same territory if the landscape is still good? Excellent question, Barb. And I'll tell you a story to illustrate this. When I started in 2010, went to various singing grounds at Great Swamp, was catching birds, banding birds, did our first field season. Fast forward to 2011, and I went to a singing ground from the previous year, and I'm hiding in the shrubs, waiting, anticipating that birds will return, basically. And a woodcock flies in, and it lands in the same singing ground from the previous year. And I have my binoculars with me because I'm a birder too. I'm in the shrubs at dusk, basically dim light. And I focus on this bird and I can see a metal band on its leg. And so it is definitely the case. And so we caught the bird the next day, and sure enough, it was the same bird that we caught on the same little 5-foot patch of ground the previous year. So that's not a universal truth, but it does illustrate that if birds live, if they don't move around the landscape, they definitely have an affinity to return to the same site each year. So long as the habitat is still good for them. The other thing to note is that that fidelity not only is tied to the singing ground, they'll also often use the same areas where they were the previous summer. So the more you do this type of tracking, it tends to become a little bit easier if you have birds that live the year, because they come back and you kind of know where to find them, and they become old friends, so to speak. So tracking them gets a little bit easier. Joyce is asking, do they nest in their roosting spots? Great question, Joyce. I'll defer to Colby because I mentioned that essentially all of my stuff was male based. Colby definitely has more insight on where females prefer to nest.
Yeah, so the females we've found, most of them actually are nesting near the male singing ground. And a lot of these other studies from Maine and Michigan have found that typically woodcock females nest within about 100 meters of the male singing area. They're not entirely sure if it's the male they sang with, but generally they're near a singing male. And so a lot of the nests in Rhode Island are actually on these like the forest edge where the opening begins and the forest kind of begins. So right in that intermediate area. I have found some out in the middle of the singing grounds, which is interesting. I don't know if that's because of lack of habitat in Rhode Island or if that's just what some of the females actually choose as a good decision, which doesn't always end in high success.
Yeah, good question. Dylan, I should have anticipated this one. Thank you. When are we going to study woodcock at Albany Pine Bush Preserve? Curious how we think habitat preference would differ there, given that it's an upland site, given that it's a xeric habitat as well. Definitely true, Dylan, your point there about being upland and xeric. I'll tell you what I think may be going on there. I would bet a little bit of money that the woodcock that you all have displaying there are there for the spring. They're there because you have females that nest. But I bet if we had some radio tags on those males, we would find the night, and then prior to dawn the next morning, I bet they leave the pine bush and go to nearby sites, maybe nearby riparian areas, that sort of thing. And then they'll return the males to do their courtship the following evening. Females probably are nesting there. I think the habitat conditions would be very good, especially the active management that you all do, whether it's burning, the mechanical treatment that you have to encourage the scrub oak community. That's really quality woodcock habitat for nesting. And so I suspect that once those females nest and those young fledge, they probably make use of those riparian areas on the surrounding landscape as well. Probably not staying tied to the Albany pine bush throughout the year, but rather moving around. To your other question, when are we going to study woodcock? We need to get there. And I have an idea. This dates back to when I worked in Texas. I worked in a small city called Nacogdoches, Texas, and Montague Whiting spent much of his career studying woodcock in the South. And I was bouncing some ideas off of him about urban woodcock, because we see in Nacogdoches, it's a small city, but where we have green space in that city, we would have woodcock roosting at night in the wintering grounds. We have woodcock at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, so it would be great to do an urban woodcock study. That's on my radar. So maybe soon, Dylan. We'll have to see if we can dig up some resources to do that. Sean, does elevation impact woodcock habitat preference? Assuming there are some wet areas nearby. Good question, Sean. We found that woodcock tended to avoid higher elevation sites, but I think that was probably mostly a result of the fact that we didn't really have a good inclusion of different elevations in our study. It would have been awesome, for example, to have truly coastal sites in Rhode Island and then very upland, quote, higher elevation sites in Rhode Island, but we didn't really have that spectrum at our study sites. Where elevation would probably start to degrade woodcock habitat would be if it became a very, very dry landscape without much of that moist soil type of environment. If you had wet areas nearby, then I suspect even at higher elevation, Sean, they would be perfectly happy, provided you had the right vegetation. Historical question from Bonnie. Back when woodcock were hunted, Do you know if it was to eat them or if it was for their feathers? Good question, Bonnie. People hunt for a variety of reasons, right? And I'll tell you, in the woodcock world, there are some people that hunt because they really value that time in the field with their upland bird dog. They value that connection. They value seeing their dog work, so to speak. So I've hunted with people that shoot woodcock and they don't eat them. To me, that's a waste. So I'm happy when I hunt with those people because then I get more woodcock to eat, right? Other people hunt woodcock because they do like to eat them. There's a species called the Eurasian woodcock as well, if you go overseas. That's a popular species to hunt. And woodcock breast sauteed in butter on toast is very, very good. So they are tasty to eat. Their feathers, despite what many people think of them as just a brown cryptic bird, when you see a woodcock up close, the cinnamon colors, the shades of brown, the black, the grays, they really are a very, very striking bird. I'm sure some people do use their feathers, not to the same extent as what you might think of with historical market hunting, though, with, you know, the fancy plumes of egrets and that sort of thing. But fly tires, for example, might have a use for woodcock feathers making flies. Yes, Tom, now you've got to see if you can find one in the wild. I'll tell you, forest clear cuts, power line right-of-ways can be useful places, edges of agricultural openings, starting in mid-March. So say the 15th through the 20th of March in many sites. Start listening for them around then. They'll start painting generally 15 minutes after dusk, and they'll continue that display for about 45 minutes after dusk.
So why don't we call it an end at that? It's 8:30,
Sure.
But I want to thank Roger Massey and Colby Slezak for an amazing presentation. Kudos.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all who have stayed to hear the answers to these questions and to learn more about woodcock. All the work you're doing is really incredible. It's really new stuff, and looking forward to seeing more of your work, Colby. And I am looking forward to getting out to Schoharie County to mistnet and help you ban some birds, Roger. So I'm looking forward to doing that again.
Yep, we'll see you in April, John, for sure.
Okay, thank
Awesome.
you. Good night, everybody.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
everyone. Good night.